My name is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I also teach on a regular basis in Toronto. And during the last 5 years or so, I've been doing more and more teaching on Skype online. This is the third part of a series I'm doing on how to use Alexander Technique directions. And it will probably be useful if you've listened to the first two parts, or watched the first two parts before you watch this. And in this section, I'm going to talk about a problem that can arise with Alexander Technique directions. In a way, it's a very good problem to have, but it can be a bit of a challenge. If you'll recall, we experimented in the earlier two sessions on using the direction "I'm free" in walking, and I imagine that some of you have had some pretty interesting experiences with that. And in particular, you might have noticed that your feet came down more lightly on the floor when you were using that direction. Or possibly you noticed when you threw the direction away or shifted to a nonsense direction, your footfalls became heavier, or you may have noticed a little heaviness within you. And that's when this problem, and I put the word problem in quotations here, comes into play. That is, if you're using, and this would be true for any Alexander Technique direction, but in this case, if you're thinking to yourself very lightly, all the things we talked about, "I'm free," and suddenly there's a little shift that you notice in yourself, especially if it's a beneficial shift, it's going to be extremely tempting to put your attention on that new thing, that change. And that has a couple of problems associated with it. One of them is you might notice you're walking a little differently and lighter, and you might be a little tempted to help that along somehow. Which, as we discussed earlier, is probably not going to be a good idea. But perhaps even more importantly, your attention is very likely to go to that change you noticed. And before you know it, you're no longer using the very direction that brought it about. And it's actually I've talked earlier about this being an experimental process, and there's a uniquely human issue that comes up here. Typically, when scientists do experiments, they change one thing and measure another, and they are, in a sense, kind of independent of those results. They're just recording it. Often it's recorded by machinery. And if a result is good, the machine doesn't get excited and forget about what it's doing. The machine just keeps on collecting the data. But we're humans, and when a nice thing happens, we tend to want to be interested in it, pay attention to it. So there's no absolutely a universal solution to this problem. But I found with my own teaching and working on myself with directions that one good way to approach it is to keep the experiments that you do, or the amount of time that you use a direction, fairly short. And I suggested earlier, maybe 20 seconds would be a good time frame, half a minute, but probably not more than that. And so that if you are using a direction and something changes for the better, you could kind of just put it aside. You could maybe very softly think to yourself, I'll get back to you shortly. But right now, I'm running an experiment, something like that. it's an art. There's no hard and fast procedure to avoid this issue, but I think it's important to be aware of it. And I might add that, and this is something I go over with all my students, that neuroscience is pretty conclusively determined that we have a fairly limited number of in-the-moment things or thoughts or ideas that we can attend to at any one point in time. And that the number that neuroscientists have come up with varies a bit from one to the other, but it's usually in the neighborhood of 7 plus or minus 2, a fairly small number of things that we can be attending to at any one time. And and some of those memory slots are taken up with things that are pretty important, like, is there a hole in the pavement in front of me that I need to avoid? Or is there a car coming on my left? That kind of stuff. So we don't have a lot of spare memory slots. And usually we're taking up one of those with the direction, I'm free. There's a memory slot taken up right there. And it's quite possible that if you think to yourself, I'm free, and your walking gets a little lighter and you're interested in that the I'm free part will disappear. And so that's why it's a pretty good idea to distance yourself in the moment from those results. But you don't want to put any energy into pushing them away either, because that's a memory slot too. So it's just a question of putting them aside for a bit. And I'll just add one more thing, this idea from neuroscience that we have this limited number of things that we can attend to at any one moment means that when we choose a direction, we need to, that's an intervention in ourselves, and we need to choose carefully. Now, I'm free is an excellent overall direction. In another session or two, I'm gonna suggest a couple of others to experiment with. But in general, you want to intervene as efficiently as possible. So, as I said, this is a uniquely human situation. We are both the experimenter and the experimentee, and with that comes some fascinating challenges. So I think that's all I'll say about that right now. There'll be 2 or 3 more short videos in this collection that I'm recording right now.